LG has been making flagship smartphones for years now, but I think it's probably fair to say that when you're looking for the absolute best of the best, LG probably isn't the company you turn to immediately. And nothing about what we've seen in the new LG G8 changes that. That said, there's a lot to like about this, and I think in a lot of ways, it is one of the most charming and most interesting phones LG has made in a really long time. Let's take a closer look. Let's just run through the basics really quickly because they are in some ways the least interesting parts of these phones. There's a Snapdragon 855 chipset in there, making this one of the first devices to use the 855 we've played with this year, and that's not going to change. It's going to be the chipset of 2019, mark my words. In addition to that, you have 6 gigs of RAM, 128 gigs of storage. We're also working with a 6.1-inch OLED display here, and it's maybe not the nicest I've ever seen, but still actually very, very good by LG standards. It runs at 3120 by 1440. It has HDR10 certification, and yeah, it's generally quite nice to look at. In my brief time with the phone, the screen itself seems more than nice enough. It's actually a little bit better than what I've generally seen from LG devices. Arguably though, the most interesting thing about this phone actually sits just north of that screen in that notch cutout. Next to the 8-megapixel front-facing camera, we have what LG calls the Z camera, or more accurately, a time-of-flight camera. Now we've heard about these a few times in the past, and we've seen them pop up in a few other devices. Long story short, that means the phone gets more nuanced depth information, and that comes into play in a couple ways. First, if you're a fan of selfie portraits, they're going to be a little better this time. It does a better job of separating you from everything else happening in the background. That's fine. What's really interesting here is that LG is kind of engaging in a bit of blue sky thinking. They're trying to figure out, well, time-of-flight cameras are becoming readily available and we're working with one now. What can you actually do with these things? Their answer was to build a way for you to control your smartphone without ever actually touching your smartphone. It's called air control, and it sort of does what the name implies, and I know what you're thinking. The idea of controlling your phone by waving your hand in front of it has been around for a while. What's really interesting about LG's approach is that they're actually giving you access to fairly granular tasks. You can, for example, hold up your hand in this weird sort of claw gesture and use it to turn the volume up and down. You can also use it to define and launch app shortcuts. So if you're, I don't know, in the kitchen cooking and want to jump into the New York Times cooking app, you can do that very easily with just a hover and a swipe. That all sounds really cool, and when it does work, it is profoundly awesome. Again, this isn't anything dramatically new, but it's nice to see something brought back from the annals of smartphone history and implemented in a way that kind of feels like it works. That said, it doesn't work great all of the time, especially on this, which in fairness is a pre-production device. Some of the software is not complete yet. Turning up the volume works, but you can't generally turn it back down because it seems like the camera can only track motion moving in one direction at a time. If you fire up the new Hand ID secure unlock feature as well, a method that LG says is, by the way, very secure, you're going to spend a lot of time trying to find that sweet spot. Basically, instead of just holding your phone up to your face or using the perfectly fine fingerprint sensor around the back, you can position your palm in front of the camera and unlock the phone without touching it. Again, totally great in theory, but you, I guarantee, are going to spend at least 2 or 3 minutes trying to find that sweet spot. And since there's no physical reference point for your hand, you have to go through that process every time. The muscle memory, I would imagine, does not build up very quickly here. So yeah, LG has packed some really ambitious things here, even if they're not, strictly speaking, the newest ideas. They're executed with some degree of elegance, and hopefully the software that comes when these things officially launch fixes some of the issues that we encountered. Beyond that, we're basically looking at last year's G7 design sort of flattened out and rounded off, and in a way that actually feels really, really nice. The dual cameras sit flush along the camera's back. The fingerprint sensor sort of nestles very nicely into the back of the phone, and the whole thing actually feels a lot more cohesive than I'm used to from an LG phone. I will say that in my brief time with the phone, and holding it up to my face in particular, my hair tends to get caught in that little gap, so it yanks when I pull it away, and it kind of hurts. Now normally I might not even notice that because I generally don't make phone calls on hands-on devices, but LG has worked up a new approach to the speaker, which kind of means I had to. Basically, There is no speaker grill here. LG built a capacitor directly into the back of this glass, so basically the entire panel is your speaker. It works well enough, and I don't think anyone who really cares about phone calls will find much to complain about here, but I should point out that when you have the volume cranked up all the way, your conversation does get pretty audible. So maybe be careful about having private conversations in public on this thing. Oh, and the cameras, by the way. There is a 12 megapixel standard camera on the back with a 16 megapixel wide angle camera. That should sound pretty familiar if you've ever used a G series device before. And in many ways, we have a very, very similar software experience. Down to the 19 AI modes here, they're exactly the same as the ones we got last year. The few improvements we have seen center around portrait mode, so studio lighting does work a little bit better, especially when you're taking them as selfies, and it's fine. I've noticed slightly better color saturation and detail in some of the photos I've taken so far. I think the dynamic range tends to get a little screwy with HDR on. I've had some trouble getting really accurate looking shots, but that's almost not the point. You kind of want the most punchy visual possible with HDR, and on some level, this is gonna give people what they want. All told, I gotta say, I did not expect to like an LG phone as much as I like this, and I've put in my time with a few of them, to be sure. The hardware feels polished in a way that I'm really not used to, and the software, while honestly just not done right now, is more ambitious than I would have expected. LG has done some interesting things here, and I don't think they all will work as seamlessly as they want it to, but it shows that LG is committed to figuring out how to improve interfaces, not just on phones that look like this, but on the phones of the future too.